Manifest Energy TV. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into this episode. What does the Bible tell us about our past? Are the stories it holds true accounts? Could it hold the key to understanding who we are and where we're from? In turn, is it possible that it is not the stories that are untrue, fanciful, or misleading, but instead our interpretation of these stories? To help us sort it all out, we're going to be speaking with historian, theologian, and writer Scotty Roberts. Scott Allen Roberts attended Bible college and theological seminary when he found himself at odds with the party line. He is the founder of the Paradigm Symposium, which is scheduled for May of this year, the publisher of Intrepid magazine. Scotty is also the author of The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, The Secret History of the Reptilians. His website is Scott Allen Roberts, so please welcome to the show, Scott Roberts. Hey, Scotty, how's it going?
Hey, Dr. Rita, how are you doing?
I am great. It is always nice having you on the show, and this new format makes it even better because we get to visit. And
oh, yeah.
I don't want to say make faces at each other because then it would cause me to make a face, which I'm not going to do.
Yeah. Well, we can. And that's the thing I think about being an adult is we can, but we operate restraint, right? Sometimes.
Well, we're going to be talking about some ancient Bible mysteries and maybe some contemporary stuff, information that you find in the Old Testament. And I'm going to kind of jump forward in the story that we find in Genesis at this point in time, but we're going to travel back. But I want to start with the story of Cain and Abel, where we find that Cain kills Abel and moves to the land of Nod. And then he encounters these people and gets married. How could that be?
Well, you know, that's one of those age-old questions, too, is, well, where did Cain get his wife? Where did he go? Because if you look at the biblical text, remember, it says he went east to the land of Nod and married a wife and built a city. And I thought, who's a city for? Because if you look at the biblical account, some of the ways I've heard this justified is that people will say, well, you know, we don't know how many years had gone by. You know, according to the biblical record at those times, people lived 800 and 900 years. And how many generations had already been spawned, you know, by Adam and Eve, and they all spread out over the earth. But the funny thing is that the biblical account doesn't say that. It says there was Adam and Eve, and they bore two sons, Cain and Abel. And when Cain murdered Abel, and Eve gives birth to Seth, the third born, she doesn't say, oh, I thank God for my 800th son. No, she says, I thank God for my son Seth, who the Lord gave me to replace my lost son Abel. And at the same time, we've got Cain moving out of Eden and going to the east to the land of Nod. So
to marry his sister.
To marry his sister. Or maybe perhaps, according to some of these theologians, it would be one of his 20 brothers' daughter's sister or something, you know, and you know, a distant shoestring relative kind of. But they're trying to put in there something that's not actually mentioned in the text. They're making assumptions rather than looking at the text and saying this is allegorical to a certain extent. And allegories don't usually have, and you know, going to add all these cousins and other generations that it's just saying Adam and Eve, and they had three sons, is what it comes down to. So by my accounting, when I look at the text, by the time Cain is heading east to the land of Nod, you've got roughly four people alive: Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel. Well, Abel, chicken scratch through Abel, and Seth on his way. And so Cain heads east, and he builds a city. Now, what is interesting is that the word that's interpreted city, it's an ancient word I believe it's a Mesopotamian word, and it's a word that could have meant compound. It could have meant city. It could have meant we don't know exactly, but they chose to interpret that, use the interpretation as city. He builds a city, and it was the city of Uruk. And I'm trying to think of Enoch. He names the city Enoch, which is after his son. So he has a son named Enoch with his wife. And yet we still have no indication that there are any other people anywhere other than he builds a city. He has this child, and eventually there's people all around him. And so Enoch there's an ancient twist in the words. Enoch becomes the same word as Uruk, and Uruk is the same word, the base word that we get for Iraq. So it's that region is where this took place. You can almost pinpoint the city. It'd be the ancient city of Uruk, and you can still go to the ancient city of Uruk. And if you look at the definition of the word for that city, the definition means first city.
Really?
And yes, first city, beautiful city, things like that. And today, it's almost a. I've seen pictures of it. It comes across as a very polluted, overpopulated, rundown, crappy-looking city on the plains. And so this is in the Euphrates River Valley. And so it's very interesting. He goes and he builds this city. And whether you think he was a real person or not, the city existed. And it's existed for a long time in human history. And it has not really been renamed over the years. It's the same name he gave it. Enoch, what's interesting, the way that moves to Uruk, is that the N in Enoch becomes an R sound in the language, linguistically. And there's all these little twists and tricks of the language. And I don't have it in front of me, or I'd give a little expose on how the linguistics work. But that is the city that he built. And I find it very interesting, too, that there's a lot of twists in these biblical stories, because you've got Cain, who I believe was the son of Eve and Nakash, the serpent character in the Garden of Eden story.
That was why I wanted to start with Cain, so that we could travel back
and
talk about that whole torrid relationship.
Yes. Ooh, and that's exactly what I think it is. It was a torrid relationship. But there's something to keep in mind with these stories. We get so entrenched in our traditions, in church traditions, and retellings of these stories, that we forget that there's deeper meanings to some of these stories, that there's linguistics to dig through. And one thing you got to do, and you experience this when you write for yourself, when you're looking at old language, you have to determine three things. Number one, what is the context of what was being written linguistically? Or first of all, I'm sorry, what language? Then the context. What would the people listening to it have understood? And then three, how do you interpret that into modern language and not excuse what it would have meant 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago? And so the audience would have understood something about the way this was being written. And when you look at the story, you've got this serpent character in the Bible, and he's always been attributed to be, in religious circles, it's Satan. The problem is he's never called that in the text. That there's no word for Satan, Lucifer, the devil, for another 1,000 years until they attribute that serpent character to Satan. What he's called in the text, in the Hebrew, is Nakash. And Nakash is one of the bright shining ones. By definition, he's the bringer of knowledge. He is the bringer of chaos. And chaos, by the way, didn't mean a super negative as we think of it now. Chaos just meant turning things upside down. It didn't mean, evil, turning things upside down. That connotation was not part of the word chaos. It just simply meant turning things around, upside down, changing things, creating chaos in the way things were to the way things are. So he's the bringer of chaos, the bringer of knowledge. He's the bright, shining one, the illuminated one is what the word stands for. And you do some comparatives when Moses was after the Exodus when he took the people out into the wilderness, and they were all grumbling against God, and so God got pissed at them, and God sent snakes to bite them all, and they started dying. Well, Moses had to create he created a bronze serpent and put it up on the pole, and anybody who looked at this would be healed. Well, the word for that was nekoshte. It was a derivation of the word Nakash. So Nakash is that character, that serpent character. And it was always interesting to me, by the way, with the vipers, the getting bitten by the snakes, and the gold and the bronze serpent, how God brings the punishment, so to speak, but people are getting bitten and dying. But then he says, "Oh, I got a way to cure that," and put the snake on the pole. And then he uses a symbol of this serpent character, who was supposed to be the progenitor of all evil from the Garden of Eden. Let's put him up on a pole, and if you look at him, you're going to be okay. And so I never quite understood that one. Why is he using a symbol of Satan, if that's who that was?
Well, and let me ask you my follow-on question. So you wrote the Rise and Fall, or the Secret History, the reptilian book. Whatever.
Oh, yeah. It was Rise and Fall of the Nephilim, and then the Secret History of the Reptilians.
The Secret History of the Reptilians. So could Nakash have actually been a reptilian that mated with Eve back in the Garden of Eden? Because we find in many cultures, characters like Enki is identified with the creation of humanity and health and healing, and is often associated with serpents, and you find that half man, half serpent character filling that role that you're attributing to Nakash. So could he have actually been a reptilian?
Well, maybe. If you're are you talking like a reptilian from like Beta Reticuli, or the constellation of Draco?
One of those.
I have my good friend and business partner and co-author John Ward would always say, "Scotty, we weren't there, we don't know." And so there are some of these things you can't know. I don't know for sure. I think that there are people who would like to attribute that because they want to build a case for there being reptilian aliens that have invaded our planet and so on, and they want to look to the Eden stories and all of that and attribute those things to it. There is nothing that outright says, well, at least not in the biblical text, there's nothing that says, that these are guys that were from other planets, other than you can extrapolate a bit. And you can look at that and say, if Nakash is certainly not human, what is he? Was he Satan? Was he... I happen to know what he was from the text. Nakash correlates to the other bright, shining ones mentioned in Scripture. And you look at Psalm 82, you get a good idea. The Elohim. Now, the Elohim were a group also known as the Divine Council. If you look at in Old Testament Scripture.
But are we talking God, the creator of the universe, the unknowable, or are we talking about something else, maybe a little more tangible?
Well, what we have, if you're looking at it from a biblical perspective, without putting our own interpretation on it, you're looking at, it's supposed to be God, the God, very God, God Almighty, God who created the universe, that fell off of his fingertips and so on, and this is Elohim, and El being the name for God, and then Him is a plurality that's tacked onto the name. So Elohim was the name used almost 3,000 times in the Old Testament for God, and Elohim means God among many gods, the plurality. Others, rabbinic schools, Christian schools of thought have all interpreted that to mean a God, a singular God possessing multiplicity of majesty and power. And so they tack the plurality on it. However, the same word is used in the Old Testament for the guy who has carved idols out of wood and made them out of clay and cast them in iron, and he's selling them in his little God idol shop out of his tent, and it says, and it talks about the man who sells the Elohim from his tent. So it's the same exact word. It's a plurality in that sense. Then you've got in Psalm 82.
Well, wait a minute. I mean, that's really in the Bible.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Talk about that a second.
I don't have the passage in front of me, and I could find it if you wanted me to. But it is there, and it's one of the warnings. It says, "Do not visit the man who sells the Elohim in his tent. This is not honoring God." It's in those. I believe it's Levitical law, if I'm not mistaken. So, and by the way, I just want you to know, on your camera, which I can see, your eyes keep flipping over to reptilian. So, I don't know if people can see that or not. Anyway.
But they will be reviewing that footage over.
Yes, they will, over and
again.
over again. I should bring that into Photoshop and see if I can do something with that. Anyway.
Now they won't be closing.
There you go. Yeah. Now my vertical slits won't show. You've got in Elohim a singular God, which can also be expressed as a plurality of gods. And so they've come down and said, well, the word actually means God among many gods, or God of many gods. Now, in Psalm 82, it shows it being used both plurally and singularly. It says, and Elohim stood in the midst of the Elohim. How do you stand in the midst of a singularity? Elohim, singular, stood in the midst of the Elohim, plural, and he said to them, you are all Elohim, the bright shining princes of heaven. But then he goes to pass judgment on them. So I interpret that from my perspective to look almost like Zeus standing before the other Olympians and getting pissed at them all and passing some judgment on them. And I think this is what you've got. This is where I've said it appears to me that the Old Testament teaches that there is a polytheistic system, but it's not really played up very much. And what you've got are these Elohim that he's chewing out. This is one of them was the serpent in the garden. He came down. Now, is it Lucifer? We don't know for sure. We're told later by some of the minor prophets, they mention 1,000 years later, after the book of Exodus or Genesis would have been written, they're talking about, well, that's Satan, the devil, in that old serpent in the garden, that old serpent devil, something like that is the language. And so that's the first time we get him called by that kind of a name. And remember, Satan, the Jewish religion had no Satan originally, as we see him now, the devil or Lucifer. They did have one of the oldest chronological books written in the Old Testament was the book of Job. And if you remember, we get phrases like the patience of Job. That all comes from Job having been tried and tested by God and come out sparkling clean. But it starts out with, it says, if you look at this, now get a picture in your mind of, we see movies like this and stuff it says, and the Satan entered the courts of heaven and accused Job before God. Said, if you take he prays, if you take away all his junk, he'll surely be against you. And you've got this, what looks almost like this chess match being played over the life of Job. Mm-hmm. And which comes across very mythological, very Olympian, very, if you look at what they're really doing there, God says, sure, go ahead and take all his stuff away. Slap him down. You can make him sick even. Just don't take his life. And I'll show you. He'll still praise me. And, and they're doing this with a man's life. He loses all of his wealth. He loses all of his children. They're all killed. And you read the book of Job, it's nasty things happen to this man.
Doesn't he get like boils and all kinds of weird disease things?
Yep. He gets boils and all that. Something is a form of leprosy. He had something like, I think it was 6 sons, and they were all gathered together, and a whirlwind comes and destroys the house and kills them all in 1 second, and he loses everything. All over, and we don't know anything in the story about the lives of the sons, the lives of the daughters and the wives and the people around them. All we know is that guy goes, yeah, go ahead. He says to the Satan, there's an article in front of his name. It's not just Satan comes to God, it says the Satan, and meaning the accuser. He came before God. He was accusing Job. And he says, and he had access to God. He's walking into the courts of heaven, according to the passage. He's not down in some fiery realm. So,
is there any linguistics tied to Satan or any etymology tied to that as far as what that word actually means in the context of the Satan?
No, well, in that context, it really means the accuser. He is the one that is coming in. He's almost like the prosecutor with a little bit of a negative twist to it. And that's all I know without having all my notes in front of me on the etymology of the word. But that's what it meant in Job. And Job is the oldest chronological book in the Old Testament. There's even places where it talks about in the book of Job about, it mentions some of the ancient religions, not by name, but by worship. It talks about, and when you look up and you see the seven sisters and you see it mentions three constellations that are distinct constellations that were part of ancient Mesopotamian religion. And Job mentions them in a passage. And so it's I don't know if it's pre-flood era that this comes from or post-flood era.
That's
but
an
it is
interesting question.
It is the oldest chronological book. Now, by the way, considering pre-flood, I was going to say this earlier, it's interesting that obviously the Garden of Eden was pre-flood by biblical chronology, and you've got Cain leaving Eden, going east to Nod, marrying a woman, building a city, naming it Enoch, which means Uruk, which is still there today. Now, when you think about that, the flood was supposed to have destroyed everything and made it all fresh. But you've got the city that Cain built is still there today. So, which makes it very interesting. Now, when you get to the Nephilim passage in Genesis 6, it does say the Nephilim passage is the prelude, the preamble to the flood story, because it goes right from the Nephilim into, and Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and God came to Noah and said, I want you to build me an ark, and blah, blah, blah. So you've got a city that existed before and after, but then you look at the Nephilim story, and it says, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, meaning pre-flood, and also afterward. And so, and then you see remnants of the Nephilim all through the Old Testament. Up to, the most familiar being Goliath, David and Goliath. Goliath was one of the remnants of the Nephilim, he and his three brothers.
Okay, hold on. We're going to come back to that. But, we're talking about that passage. And so we have the Elohim, the God among many gods. So we have that group. And now we have the sons of God. Now, who are these guys? You read some of this stuff, and to me, it just says, sorry, extraterrestrial.
You read it in the English.
Because God is up there.
See, here was one of the things, and this is what bothered me when I was in seminary and when I was in ministry, we're talking 30 years ago. And I would see these passages that would say, and the sons of God came down and intermingled with the daughters of men and had children by them. And I thought, what the hell does that mean? I've never heard that story before. And it's right at the beginning of the flood story. Why are we not taught this? And so I would ask my seminary professors, what does this mean? Who are these sons of God? And I went to the original language. Now, one of the things that they taught us in seminary in systematic theology was language means something. It's important. And so that's why you would always, if you go into like a Baptist church, many times you'll hear a preacher, he'll be up there and going, now we're talking about this passage about Luke, and I want you to look at what it says in the original Koine Greek, because that's important to understanding what the passage means. This is what we were taught in that context, in those settings. Language means something. So I look back at it, and that passage says, for sons of God, it's B'nai Ha-Elohim, which means the sons of the God of many gods, or those who are of the God of many gods. So it's talking about the sons of God, those who are of the God of many gods. The plurality of Elohim are the ones who came down and intermingled with the daughters, and I can't remember the Hebrew word for daughters off the top of my head, the daughters of Adam. or Adam or man. And so I would ask, who are these guys? And I was given explanations as, oh, well, I don't think this is anything weird or extraterrestrial. This is because this is merely the sons of the aristocrats who built the schools of the prophets, and they went down into the valley slumming with the common women. I said, oh, okay, so this is, and they said, no, it has nothing to do with anything supernatural. This is just human guys going down to human women and having kids by them. And I said, really? I said, then.
And so were these like Cain's kids? Were these like Adam and Eve's kids? Whose kids were they?
It doesn't identify who they are. But this is in Genesis 6, and there's obviously civilization where you've got kids mixing with kids. And I said, well, that bothers me, that explanation. I said, because you teach us that language means something, and in the language there is a distinct contrast between the men and the women. It says the Bene Ha-Elohim went into the daughters of Adam. I said, there's a contrast there. I said, why doesn't it say the sons of the aristocrats who built the school of the prophets went down and slummed with the women in the valley? I said, it doesn't say that. I says, and then it talks about this supernatural sounding offspring, the Nephilim. And the answer I was given when I'd asked that and point that out was basically, we don't talk about that here. You keep quiet about that. And as strange as that seems, I even went to my very good friend, Dr. Ayling, who was the president of the seminary. He's an Egyptologist. He's somebody who got me into the things I'm into today initially. He has been the chair of history at the University of Northwestern for the last 30 years. He is also the president of the Near Middle East Archaeological Society. And this guy told me at the time, he says, well, if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it, but we really don't make that a point of teaching here. He was one of recognizing the fact that the hierarchy was saying you can't really talk about this, but one who recognized that it was there in the passage. So what you've got is a passage that says that the sons of the God, or those, literal interpretation, those of the Elohim, those of the God of many gods, descended to the earth and had sex with human women. People think they're fallen angels. There's another problem. The word for angel in the Hebrew, in that context, is malach for angel. Malachim, if it's plural, just like Elohim, Nephilim, Malachim. The him is the plural suffix tacked on the end of a word. Word does not appear in the passage. But what does appear in the passage is Elohim, the plurality of Elohim. These are not angels. They're not fallen angels. And they get the fallen angel part from the word Nephilim, which, when you break that down, Nephal means to fall, to come down, for one to leave one's first estate and go to another. That's the broadened meaning of it. And the him just puts plurality. Those who left their first estate and went to another. This is who these guys are. But the Nephilim are not the Elohim. So did the Nephilim leave anywhere? That's the big question you have to look at. They were on the earth, but they were the descendants. They were the offspring of this mating of Elohim with daughters of men.
Hi, this is Dr. Rita Louise. We hope you've been enjoying the program today. If you'd like to hear more from this guest or other guests we've had on the show, please visit www.justenergyradio.com.